What if everything you knew about your family's history was deliberately altered? What if your ancestors' true identity was systematically erased from records, treaties torn up, and an entire heritage stolen through the stroke of a pen? For millions of Black Americans, this isn't a hypothetical question. It's a reality that DNA testing is now revealing in ways that are reshaping our understanding of American history. Recent DNA studies are uncovering a truth that has been buried for centuries. Many Black Americans aren't just descendants of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas. They're also members of hidden Black native tribes that were living on this continent long before Columbus ever set foot on American soil. These weren't just tribes in what we now call the United States. We're talking about indigenous peoples across the Americas, from Mexico to the Philippines, throughout South America, Brazil, and Argentina. The evidence is in the blood, and blood doesn't lie. These DNA tests are revealing Native American markers that span generations, markers that tell a story of people who were here first. But here's where it gets disturbing. Over the centuries, entire Native American tribes were systematically reclassified through legislation, census records, and official paperwork. Members of these hidden Black native tribes were stripped of their indigenous identity and renamed as Negro, Colored, or Black. This wasn't an accident. This was a deliberate strategy. When European colonizers arrived, they found thriving indigenous communities with dark skin. These communities had established territories, treaties, and rights to the land, but recognizing them as Native Americans meant acknowledging their claims to vast territories. It was far more profitable to reclassify them as something else entirely. The process was methodical and ruthless. First came the treaties. Native tribes across the Americas signed agreements with European powers and later with emerging nations. These treaties guaranteed land rights, sovereignty, and recognition. But as time passed, these same treaties became inconvenient obstacles to expansion and profit. So they were simply ignored, filed away, and forgotten. Then came the paperwork war. Census takers would arrive in indigenous communities and make arbitrary decisions about racial classification. A family that had lived on the same land for generations suddenly found themselves listed as Negro instead of Indian. Their children grew up being told they were something other than what their grandparents knew them to be. The legal system reinforced these changes. Laws were passed that defined who could and couldn't claim indigenous status. Blood quantum requirements were introduced, creating impossible standards for people whose records had been deliberately obscured or destroyed. If you couldn't prove your indigenous heritage through European-style documentation, then legally you weren't indigenous at all. But the most insidious part of this erasure was how it affected identity within families. Children grew up hearing whispered stories about ancestors who lived differently, who had different relationships with the land, who practiced different traditions. But officially, those stories didn't matter. The paperwork said otherwise. Generations passed, and the connection to indigenous heritage became fainter. Families moved, often forced to relocate by economic pressures or outright displacement. The stories became family legends, dismissed by some as wishful thinking or romanticized memories. The official narrative took hold. If the government said you were black, then that's what you were. Yet something remarkable happened. Despite centuries of systematic erasure, the genetic evidence remained. DNA doesn't care about legislation or census classifications. It carries the truth of ancestry regardless of what any government document might say. And now, with modern genetic testing, that truth is emerging. The results are startling. Test after test reveals significant Native American ancestry among people who were raised believing they were solely of African descent. These aren't trace amounts or distant connections. We're seeing substantial indigenous genetic markers that indicate recent Native American ancestors, sometimes just a few generations back. The geographic spread of this phenomenon is breathtaking. From the eastern seaboard to the Gulf Coast, from the Great Plains to the Southwest, Black American families are discovering indigenous roots that connect them to specific tribal regions. Some are finding connections to tribes that were supposedly extinct or completely assimilated centuries ago. What's particularly fascinating is how these DNA revelations align with oral histories that families maintained despite official records. Stories about great-grandmothers who knew herbal medicine, ancestors who had special relationships with certain animals, or family traditions that seemed different from typical African American customs, are suddenly making sense in light of indigenous heritage. The implications extend far beyond individual families. We're talking about potentially millions of people whose true heritage was systematically obscured. This represents one of the largest cases of identity theft in human history, perpetrated not by individuals, but by institutions and governments. Consider the legal ramifications. Many of these hidden Black Native tribes had treaties that were never properly dissolved. They had land rights that were never legally transferred. If these communities can prove their indigenous heritage and their connection to specific tribal entities, it could reshape property law and tribal recognition across the Americas. The cultural implications are equally profound. Indigenous practices, languages, and traditions that were thought to be lost forever might actually be preserved in families who didn't even know they were carrying this heritage. Spiritual practices, agricultural knowledge, and artistic traditions could be recovered and revitalized. But this rediscovery isn't happening in a vacuum. It's occurring at a time when indigenous rights are gaining international recognition, when genetic genealogy is becoming more sophisticated, and when people are increasingly questioning official historical narratives. The tools for uncovering the truth have never been more powerful. The resistance to acknowledging this hidden history is also revealing. Some institutions that benefited from the original erasure have little interest in correcting the historical record. Recognizing the true scope of indigenous heritage among Black Americans would require acknowledging centuries of systematic deception and potentially redistributing resources and recognition. Yet the evidence continues to mount. Genetic studies are being corroborated by historical research, archaeological findings, and anthropological evidence. Scholars are re-examining old documents with fresh eyes, finding references to dark-skinned indigenous peoples that were previously overlooked or misinterpreted. The personal impact on individuals discovering this heritage is profound. Many describe feeling a sense of completion, of finally understanding family stories that never quite fit the official narrative. Others talk about connecting with landscapes and environments in ways that suddenly make sense given their genetic heritage. Some are actively seeking to reconnect with tribal communities and indigenous practices. They're learning languages their ancestors spoke, participating in ceremonies their families once knew, and rebuilding connections that were deliberately severed generations ago. This movement is also changing how we understand the broader African American experience. The traditional narrative of forced migration from Africa, while absolutely true for millions, isn't the complete story. For many families, the American experience includes both forced displacement from Africa and systematic erasure of existing indigenous identity. The convergence of these revelations with modern social justice movements is creating powerful momentum for recognition and restoration. People are demanding not just acknowledgement of what was taken, but active efforts to restore what can be recovered. As these DNA studies continue and more families uncover their hidden heritage, we're witnessing what many describe as a prophetic unfolding. Voices that were silenced for centuries are finding their way back to the surface. Identities that were deliberately obscured are being reestablished through the unshakable testimony of genetic evidence. The truth, as they say, has a way of surfacing. And in this case, it's surfacing through the very blood that carries the memory of who we really are, regardless of what any document might claim. The hidden black native tribes are hidden no more, and their descendants are reclaiming their place in the true history of the Americas.